Paramedics, what is the most disturbing thing you saw on the job? Paramedic here. A group of kids broke into a paper factory and started playing go-karts with the forklifts, which had keys in them still for some reason. A forklift gets hit, topples over, and the canopy falls onto one of the kids, crushing him. Cops arrived before us and had to tell us to walk carefully as there were pieces of the kid's head all over the ground. As more people arrived on the scene, you started to hear a crunch here or there from small skull pieces, some sounds you don't forget. I worked with a guy who was a paramedic. He said the worst thing he had ever seen was when they got a call from a guy's elderly, handicapped mother. She was unable to walk or leave the house, and he lived in the basement unit and wasn't answering the phone. Paramedics show up for welfare check, and the unit is spotless. No signs of break-ins or foul play. They searched room by room until they hit the bathroom, where they found him dead, naked, in a pool of blood. Turns out he had a bowling pin bolted to the floor in his bathroom that he used to stimulate his prostate. He lubed it up, squatted down, slipped, and it ripped his taint open. He was suctioned onto the thing and wasn't able to get himself up to call an ambulance and bled out on the floor. The guy was leaning against the door, so it took my coworker some effort to force the door open to even get to him. Once they got in, the blood was congealed, so he had been dead for at least a few days. It took 3 paramedics to lift the guy off of the pin because of the suction effect and swelling in the guy's body. My dad was the only licensed paramedic in our Tri-County area for many years. His area covered 2 interstates and numerous major highways in Ohio. He is undoubtedly the toughest person I've ever known, just based on the stories I've heard him recounting when he didn't know I could hear him and secondhand stories from other first responders who have worked for him. In a motorcycle accident on the interstate, a group of 4 bikers riding in loose formation had gone to pass an 18-wheeler, but they stayed too wide the whole way. My dad had taught me long before that this was a cardinal no-no. You stay as far away as possible from big rigs because the winds near them get strong and unpredictable. Well, these folks failed to heed that warning, and one of the front inside riders got drawn in towards the truck, overcompensated the other way, and ran into his friend. He was then thrown off his bike, and while falling, got caught on either a foot peg or the brake lever or some other protrusion, and was, and I quote, unzipped from his ankle to his armpit like a Halloween costume. Back in the early 90s, I ran a stabbing call in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. As we approached the scene, the first arriving fire truck came over the radio and told dispatch, "Tell the medic unit that the police are currently shooting their patient." When we arrived at the scene, we found out that our patient was on PCP and had stabbed her boyfriend with a 10-inch carving knife. Another medic unit had been dispatched for him. After police arrived, she stripped naked and started to walk toward the police. After they raised their weapons and shouted for her to stop, she stuck the knife fully into her cooter and pulled it up to her navel, thus disemboweling herself. She kept walking toward the police line, who were so freaked out they shot her 14 times. 2 of the cops were actually crying when we got on the scene. We transported her to the trauma center, where she died within the hour. I work as a paramedic in Canada, and we were dispatched to a call by the police. We were requested to bring a box of N95 masks. My partner and I were quite confused, but did as we were told. When we arrived on the scene, a police officer met us outside. When I handed him the box of masks, he looked significantly relieved. My partner asked what was going on, and the officer directed us to the door. Within 2 steps of where we were, we began to smell it. That oh-so-obvious smell of death. Death that has had time to fester. At this point, we understand the request for masks. As we poke our heads through the door, we are greeted by a clearly deceased human. It was a woman who probably weighed on the light side of 400 pounds when she was solid, which, at this moment, she was not. The officer proceeded to tell us that she hadn't been seen or heard from in 2 weeks, and when someone finally came to check on her, they found her as a puddle. To make matters worse, she had her heat blasting. It was the middle of summer. All her blinds open, and she was seated in direct sunlight. It was probably the most disgusting sight I had ever seen. I was an EMT 25 years ago. Cops got called to a trailer park to do a welfare check on a resident. It was a single guy who hadn't been seen in a week or so, and the neighbors were now complaining of a bad smell emanating from the guy's mobile home. They asked us to come investigate with them and advised us to bring along some of the fire air packs to help us survive the smell. Now, the guy is almost assuredly dead at this point, but we were only allowed to declare somebody dead in the field if they had rigor mortis, lividity, blood pooling due to lack of circulation, or were dismembered. I was the new guy at the time, so the experienced paramedic turns to me and says, "Pack up, rookie. You're going in with me." We enter the guy's unair-conditioned trailer and find him lying on his back in between his sofa and coffee table. He is very obviously dead, but the paramedic decides we need to check him for lividity. We each grab an arm to hoist the guy up to check his back when it happened. You know how the skin just slides off of roast chicken? Well, this guy's skin separated at the shoulder and started to slide down his arm as we tried to lift him. We both instantly dropped him in a heap, and the paramedic declared loudly, "Yep, he's dead. Let's get out of here." If you enjoy this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. Thank you. Don't ever put your feet on the dashboard. Passengers, keep your seatbelts on and your feet on the floor. Seriously. Husband was driving and wife was in the passenger seat. Her feet were in a squatting position on the dash when their car was rear-ended and shoved into a boat trailer. Her left femur turned to powder when it made contact with her left shoulder, shattering her shin bones. Her leg actually ended up looping over her shoulder, and her foot/ankle was resting between her back and the seat rest. At first, I thought it was a scarf. I was wrong. Her right knee managed to get shoved back directly into her jaw, split it in 2 directions, knocked out all her teeth, and her tongue was halfway swallowed, then attempted to be thrown back up. She didn't look human. My partner is in the back seat, holding her head still, while I'm throwing a collar on her, planning a tracheotomy to help her breathe. I'll never forget her eyes and head shaking, like everything in her was trying to reboot and figure out what the f just happened. We tried CPR, we tried AEDs, and every time we touched her, her body responded with bubble-wrap sounds of shattered rib cages, her neck filled with blood, bone, and sinew, and her legs still wrapped all over herself. We tried to punch a breathing hole, but hit her hyoid bone, which fragmented everywhere. We all kinda sat there for a second, trying to make her comfortable as she had her last thrashes and passed. We never got her breathing again and was pronounced DOA. That was the call that made me quit. Not my story, but from my instructor when I was taking EMT training. A convertible had flipped, I'll never get a convertible because of this fear, and skidded down the road. Both the woman who was driving and the child in the car seat had half their heads ground away by the sliding car. There were 2 very distinct streaks of blood and brain down the road. That was the day she said she decided to be an instructor instead of an on-call paramedic. A friend of mine is a paramedic. Here's a story I'll never forget. He was dealing with a patient with a colostomy bag and was missing most of his colon. The patient was feeling unwell and complaining of abdominal pain. Turns out his colostomy bag had backed up, which they discovered when he started puking. Can you guess what he was puking? That's right, he was puking shit. Stinky, runny, liquid shit, right out of his mouth. I can't even begin to imagine how gross that must have been. I'm a former EMT. This is the call that made me quit. My unit gets called to a multi-car collision on the interstate. We arrive to a sedan on its side in the right lane and an SUV in the median on top of the cable barrier. 2 males and 1 female are walking around with minor scrapes. The woman is hysterical. Fire rescue was working on the SUV. When it rolled, it had landed on the cable post, perfectly squishing the child in the center car seat. The 5-year-old sister was pinned by the neck and waist to the seat, and the 7-year-old brother was decapitated with his head sitting on the roof, basically looking at his younger sister. I removed the head and talked to the little girl, who was the age of my daughter at the time, telling her she would be okay. Fire rescue cut the cables to release her from the seat, and because there was tension on the cables, they moved and sliced her in half. She didn't make it 20 feet to the ambulance and died in my arms. Not a paramedic, but I'm a recovery diver. I was diving in a creek, trying to recover bodies from a small plane crash. The plane ran out of gas and the cotton field next to the creek looked like a good place to land in the dark. Instead of landing in the middle of the field, the pilot aimed for the edge. The plane caught a tree and it cartwheeled and essentially disintegrated. Bodies were not found, but body parts were. Most of the parts could be seen high up in the trees on the bank of the creek. I specifically remember a human lung hanging from a limb about 30 feet up in the tree. Not a paramedic, but I have first responder training in a forestry industry setting. In a job I was supervising, I got a short radio call for distress by a lumberjack, so I headed out to the scene and arrived before anyone else. The dude was conscious, forehead on the steering wheel and with intestines all in his arms and some on his feet. Not able to move the guy by myself, I reclined the seat to tilt him back and did a quick inspection. Thankfully, his chainsaw only cut the skin and muscle of his stomach, and no entrails were damaged. Wearing latex gloves, I carefully put all of his insides back inside and used a water bottle to clean the dirt on his guts that were on the floor. Then I used clean gauze, a clean plastic shopping bag, and duct tape to keep his entrails inside as the heli evac came to get him out. After he was evacuated, I checked his GPS. The tough guy walked almost 1.5 kilometers with his intestines in his arms, back to his truck to radio for help. In my EMT class, an instructor told me about one of her calls to a freeway accident. 2 cars were involved, and one had an elderly couple in it. Since she was so small, my instructor was often assigned the job of crawling through the car windows to stabilize patients while the crew worked on prying the doors open. She crawled into the back seat of the elderly couple's car and held manual C-spine for the woman, holding someone's head in place to prevent an injury. As she held the head, it came off in her hands. The woman had been decapitated by the accident. She had to take a couple of weeks off after that and talk to a therapist to help cope. I can't imagine what it must have been like to go through something like that. I work in the ER as a paramedic in a level 1 trauma center. We had a patient who doused himself in gasoline and lit himself on fire. He was still smoldering when EMS brought him in. Over 90% of his body was burned with his skin sloughing off with the slightest touch. His eyes had turned to liquid, and his joints were fused together so he was not able to bend his arms or legs. He was burned down to the bone in some areas, and his airway was completely scorched from the heat. The fire was so hot and intense that his organs were literally cooked and his urine was black as oil when we put a catheter in. He told the EMS crew who responded to the call that he did not want pain medication and that he deserved to die in pain. The patient was an unmedicated schizophrenic. We eventually found out who he was, and I was able to research his charts, which gave great insight into why this happened. As far back as 2017, he had been expressing a desire to burn himself alive, as he felt this was the only way to cleanse his wicked spirit and be allowed into heaven. His family relocated across the country, and he was left homeless and without medical care for well over a year, which eventually led to him doing what he did. It truly was a sad case in all directions. EMT here. I've got one that sticks with me. A new dialysis patient had just gotten his shunt implanted. He wasn't comfortable with it and must have been fussing with it, and it came out. For those that don't know, a dialysis shunt is connected to the brachial artery, just after the aorta, so that it can pump a high volume of blood into the dialysis machine to filter it. With the shunt ripped out, though, the heart was basically just pumping blood straight out of the body. By the time we get there, this guy is lying next to his couch, just empty. You would almost think Dracula had gotten to him, if not for the human body's worth of blood on the floor and walls around him. We tried CPR for the family's sake, but his heart had nothing to pump. UK paramedic here. I went to a call a few years ago, seemed run-of-the-mill. I arrived at the house of an extremely obese woman. The stench was horrendous. There was rotten food and animal waste everywhere, and she hadn't moved out of the bed in years, so the bed had mostly collapsed, as she had just been defecating where she lay. Her fat had grown around the springs, causing wounds that had no chance to heal, so her entire backside was rotting away. We attempted to get her out of the bed with the help of the fire service and a few doctors for enhanced support. Our plan was to take the wall out of the house and take the bed with her, but we had no way of transporting her like that, and no hospital could house something like that. In the end, there was a team of hospital staff at her house until she died, which was only a few days later. I burned my uniform after that. No amount of washing was going to get rid of the smell. Not my goriest case, but maybe the most bizarre. A guy wanted to end his life. He got into his SUV, left the back window open, attached a metal cable around his neck in the driver's seat and strung it out the back window and wrapped it around a tree. He then hit the gas, and the truck lurched forward and decapitated him. Death by shotgun is always the worst, though. A kid I went to high school with did himself in that way. There wasn't enough of his head left to tell who he was. I'm a former paramedic of 15 years. I used to get this question all the time, and people always assume we're going to tell them about some gnarly injury. No, it's not the bloody injuries that cause us to drink and sabotage our relationships. It's cases like these. The worst call I ever ran was a shaken baby. Mom couldn't get her 1-month-old baby to stop crying, so she shook him, causing massive damage to his brain. Baby went into what we call status epilepticus, which is a non-stop seizure. Then she called 911. The filth of that trailer still haunts me to this day. Human and animal waste, old rotting pizza boxes, overwhelming cat urine smell, dirty diapers, needles, and so many cigarette butts. The little helpless infant was writhing in this filth, while the mother made a Pop-Tart in the midst of the suffering that she caused. That call permanently changed me. Paramedic here. It's like 11:30 at night, and we get a call for a pregnant lady experiencing cramps and bleeding. We get on scene, and we find this lady standing in her driveway, pale and shaking. She wouldn't answer my questions, and no one else was around. I figured she lost a lot of blood. I used a Doppler to listen for fetal heart tones once we got her in the ambulance. There was nothing. I told my partner that I was going to check inside to see if anybody else was there, so I grabbed the flashlight and headed towards the open garage. I noticed a lot of blood trailing inside, so I followed it, turning on house lights as I went. It led me through the garage, the kitchen, the living room, and into the bathroom where the only light in the house was already on. I called out, "Paramedics, anyone here?" No answer. I open the bathroom door and see the blood trailing towards the toilet. Right next to the toilet was a miscarried fetus. It was gross. It smelled horrible, and I suddenly felt really freaked out. I remembered that mothers tend to still require bonding time with their baby after a miscarriage, so I picked the body up and put it in a bag. Then I returned to the ambulance. Once inside, my partner had started fluids on the patient, and I told him what I found. We decided to just hit the road and get her to the hospital. She didn't say anything for a while. Finally, the mom looked at me and quietly asked if she could have her baby. I said, "Of course," and handed her the body still in the bag. She teared up and held it tight for the rest of the trip. I just sat there, quietly observing her vitals and holding her hand. I'm a road crash rescue operator in Australia. My pager went off while I was working at a mine. I took one look and read, "Major incident, child trapped, 130 kilometers West Highway." The guy I was working with could probably read my face because he didn't say a word when I sprinted off. In this job, you receive so little information about what you're about to witness, and when you see the word child in the initial call-out, this only compounds your emotions. I remember sitting behind the wheel, willing the truck to go faster, faster, faster. The child had likely been trapped for hours because it's such a remote area and the police are notoriously slow at activating us. When we arrived at the scene, it was complete chaos. The mother was catatonic and had to be sedated and taken away in an ambulance. The other siblings were terrified and some paramedics were in tears. We approached the vehicle and found the child pinned beneath the rear left wheel. His skull had been split open by the impact and brain matter was thrown up to 45 meters from the scene. As soon as I witnessed that, I relaxed. I knew that he was long gone before we arrived and had not been suffering. It took close to 18 hours before the road crash investigation team arrived. The poor kid was not smelling very nice by that point. Human insides have a very distinctive smell. Anyone who knows the smell will understand. It was determined that the child was in a booster seat in the back and was playing up and taking his arms out of the straps. The mother turned around to rouse on him, lost control of the vehicle, which tumbled down the highway and flung the child out, and by providence, the car landed back on top of him. The father lived on a remote property approximately 150 kilometers from the accident scene. He left his house with a full tank of fuel in his XR6, and it was empty on his arrival at the scene. One can imagine what sort of speed he was traveling at. It didn't hit me until the following morning, when we were sweeping up the remains on the road to clear the highway. I recall there being a large volume of toddlers' clothes strewn up the road. I picked them all up and threw them off the side thinking, Well, the family won't be needing these. I have attended many grisly road crash incidents, but that one sticks. It was my first fatality, and I learned a lot about the resilience of human skin, at the same time learning about the fragility of humans as a whole. The smell still sticks with me. Thank you for watching, and please subscribe to my channel for more Reddit stories. See you in the next video.